Travel, especially overseas travel, was once a mark of sophistication, but like many things since COVID-19, its absence during the pandemic is making us question its continued existence given its negative impacts. In these climate conscious times we live in, flight shaming, a global movement to stigmatize air travel, has become a thing. Short term accommodation websites like Airbnb are increasingly blamed for exacerbating our housing crisis. So, can tourists and the industry that supports them be vindicated? The author of a new book sets to find out. Here to talk about reservations, the pleasures and perils of travel, is Vancouver-based author Steve Burgess. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Uh, Easy question. What made you write the book?
You know, it's actually a very long question. I've been writing travel stories for many, many years, and I've long dreamed about writing a book about those travel stories. Unfortunately, not to get it too much into industry stuff, but travel books are a very hard sell. And I was talking to over dinner with David Beers, the founding editor of the Tyee, and we were talking about my idea that I wanted to write a travel book, and he was the one who was telling me it's got to be about more. It can't just be you spinning some cute travel stories. It's got to be about more than that. And he was the one who really set me on the path of doing an investigation of travel itself and the travel industry. And that really changed the shape of the book that I had thought about writing. Before it was just going to be, I tell you what happened to me when I was in Morocco, and then this became something, I think, something more, and thanks to Dave, something a lot better.
The book begins in Tokyo with a misunderstanding about the time-honored tourist pastime, snapping vacation pictures.
Yes.
Did you ever think that particular story would end up in a book?
I don't know about a book, but I'll tell you this, and this is maybe journalists thinking. When I walked away at the end of that story, I was thinking, hot damn, this is going to be a great story. But I actually wrote that story first for Swerve magazine, the now defunct publication of the Calgary Herald. So no, it's true. Like, writers tend to think that way. I almost got thrown in a Japanese jail, and when I was walking away, I was thinking, "Oh, this is great, man. This is gold." So yeah.
And just by way of context, you were mistaken for someone engaging in what's called upskirt photography.
Upskirt photography. Yeah. I
The problem there.
I proclaim my innocence here on the John Ackerman show. I say I was unjustly accused. But it's interesting thing. One thing I had in the article, which actually isn't in the book, because my editor thought it was kind of a digression, was I actually found a young woman who apprehended an upskirt photographer in Shibuya, in the same neighborhood where I was. So it does happen. There's no doubt about it. There are guys there trying to take photos up women's skirts.
Now, overall in the book, you identify what we can call the sins of the modern tourist and modern tourism, from the climate impacts of air travel to the deleterious effect Airbnb can have on communities. So, to borrow a phrase from your book, is every vacation essentially a guilt trip?
That's kind of the mindful tourist, and that's a phrase that was coined by a group in Copenhagen. They set out to find the mindful tourist. If you are a mindful tourist to someone who is a responsible traveler, it's almost unavoidable to have some guilt now. And the question is, what do you do about it? Do you stop traveling? Or do you find a way to do it better? I hate to be a spoiler here, but I don't think there are any easy answers in my book. I'd certainly be a giant hypocrite if I sat here and said, "Oh, people shouldn't travel," because here I am in the book telling all my travel stories, and I don't intend to stop traveling. And yet, it's just more complicated than it used to be, isn't it? I mean, there really are serious issues that did not exist in the era before we were aware of climate change, and also before the era of cheap airfares. And so, when you look back on, I mentioned in the book the scene in the movie La Dolce Vita where Marcello Mastroianni and I think it might be Gina Lollobrigida, I don't know, are wading in the Trevi Fountain. Well, back in when that film was made, when that scene was filmed in 1959, the the number of tourists in Rome was an absolute fraction of what it is now. People traveled, but the boom in travel has just been absolutely exponential. And so we are facing effects now that long ago travelers just never did. You know, we have to concentrate now, we have to think more about the effect that these mobs have on the places that we want to cherish and we want to appreciate and not destroy.
You also raised an interesting point I'd never thought of before, but we're approaching the finiteness of air travel. And I bring this up because you spoke with William Rees, the UBC professor who was among the first to use the term carbon footprint. He thinks as fossil fuels run out, international air travel could be the first to go. So, an absolute ban on air travel except during emergencies, is that realistic?
He and I had a basically a polite argument about that, a discussion about that. And because he's the most extreme voice in the book, he says air travel will be the first to go. My thought is air travel will be the last to go. As long as there's a drop of jet fuel, there will be planes in the sky. But what I said to, he said, you know, air travel is, we've got to crack down. You know, we've got to realize that, you know, air travel has to be stopped. And I said, look, professor, you will never get government planes out of the air. You will never get military jets out of the air, and you will never get private jets out of the air. You will always have rich people, and you will always have governments, and you will always have the military. And his answer was, yeah, well, so be it. I said, look, the only people you're going to stop from flying are people like us. And he said, well, that's the way it is. Life isn't fair. I don't want to, you know, make the guy sound terrible, but he's just saying, look, you know, life isn't fair. We have to take drastic measures, and that's the way it is. But the thing is, no, I don't think there's a chance in heck that that will ever happen. It would be any government that tried to crack down on air travel would be committing, you know, political suicide. And also, how are you going to get the governments of the world to work together? You know, right now, when you have opposition parties who won't even accept a carbon tax, are you going to get opposition parties that are saying, okay, let's cancel travel? You know, it's no, it's not going to happen.
Do you think things like a frequent flyer tax or banning short haul flights where bus or train alternatives exist, like France has done, could be a way forward?
That's a really interesting question. You know, the banning short haul flights thing was, you know, that's a strong measure that they took in Europe. Now, one thing is that they've got a much better train system over there. So it just makes more sense to take the train rather than taking a short haul flight. That doesn't, as William Rees, to his credit, pointed out, in Canada, that doesn't work. I mean, when I go back to visit my hometown of Brandon, Manitoba, that's the equivalent of traveling from Paris to Kiev. So, you know, distances in Canada don't really allow for that. But what really kind of surprised me is, as you may recall, one of the main experts I talked to, and a guy who was just a wonderful guy to talk to, Giulio Mattioli is his name, and he's at the University of Dortmund in Germany. And he was saying that banning short haul flights isn't that big a deal because his studies and the studies that he's been involved in show that short haul flights are really a minuscule part of the emissions problem. That in fact, the bad flights are the ones I take, you know, going from Vancouver to Rome. That's where the real emissions happen. So short haul flights are not that big a deal in the
Another
overall climate emission thing.
Another big issue you've identified in the book, and it's a timely one here in BC, is short-term accommodations like Airbnb. As of the 1st of May, Victoria legislating that hosts can only rent spaces if they are within their primary residences. What do you make of steps like this?
Again, complicated. It'd be great to say, oh, well, I've got a very definitive opinion. But I tell you one thing, writing this book ended up it ended up making me feel rather conflicted about things because you really do start to see both sides of it. I generally am in favor of cracking down on Airbnb. I do think that the lure of short-term rental really does unbalance the housing market, and also you start to see these mega hosts. You know, it's supposed to be like people. I need a little bit of help paying down the mortgage, you know, so I'm going to rent out my room. That's great, but in fact, as it so often happens, it morphs into something bigger. So you've got these basically unlicensed hotel chains that are really Airbnb operators that have 10,000 accommodations, you know. So I support it, but on the other hand, I have sympathy for people who are like, you know, if you bought a property intending to rent it out and now you can't, uh, you know, you're taking a hit there. I think overall, you know, I quote people on both sides of the Airbnb question. My own feeling is I tend to side with people who say that Airbnb does need to be reined in, not wiped out, but reined in. I think it does unbalance the housing market.
A big sweeping question here. I know you'll like this.
Uh-oh.
Do you consider yourself a tourist or a traveler? And what is the difference?
That is one of the central questions of the book that I wrestle with. Obviously, as I have traveled, I have considered myself a traveler, you know, and oh, those other people, they're just tourists. And yet I try throughout the book to hold that assumption up to the light and examine it a little bit, because really, if there's a whole bunch of people in a Boeing and we're all flying overseas, can you go through and say, oh, this guy's a traveler, this guy's a tourist, this guy's a traveler, this guy's a tourist? We're all contributing to the same phenomenon. We're all on the same jet with the same emissions. So how can I put on airs and call myself a traveler? Because you know, there's a fellow named Dean McCannell who wrote a book long ago about an academic book about tourism, and he put it rather bluntly. He said, "God is dead, but man's desire to be better than his fellows lives on." And he was talking about the fact that people want to distinguish themselves from the other tourists. Having said all that, the thing that I think is important when I travel is that, for one thing, and I know not everybody can do this, but I travel alone. I don't make plans. I don't join tour groups. Uh, I wander is what I do, and I depend a lot on serendipity. And that, I think, leaves me free to discover what I discover. G.K. Chesterton, the English author, 100 years ago or so, he phrased it a little bit. Instead of saying traveler versus tourist, he called tourists, he called them trippers. And he talked about travelers versus trippers. And the way he put it was rather elegant. He says, the traveler sees what he sees, the tripper sees what he has come to see. And that is the difference. It's like, I'm here to see the Taj Mahal. Okay, I seen it, I got the picture, now I'm out of here. That to me is not the kind of travel that I want to engage in. I want to wander and see what I find, and also try to get a sense of what it's like to live somewhere. You know, what is life like in this place? So I do think that there is a style of travel that is more enriching, but it's just that if I try to say that I'm completely different from an ordinary tourist, I'm being kind of arrogant, you know, because really, if tourism is a global problem in terms of, you know, climate change, I'm as big a part of the problem as anything.
Now, the book is part memoir, part travelogue, part personal research project, all wrapped together by your characteristic wit. What do you hope people get out of the book?
I just hope that they will, you know, we take travel for granted. You know, it's like, let's go to a beach and have a Mai Tai, or let's go to Paris and shop. And I hope that the book will just make people stop and think about travel itself rather than just the trip that you happen to be taking, but thinking about travel itself and the travel industry, and that maybe that will have an impact overall on the choices that people make. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it was time for a book that was more about the experience of travel and about the travel industry and the effects of the travel industry, and various aspects of travel. You know, I mean, I look into a lot of different things like religious attractions and Amish tourism. There's just lots of little nooks and crannies in the industry that are really fascinating, and some of which I just kind of stumbled across by accident. So it was enlightening and educative to write the book.
The name of the book is Reservations, The Pleasures and Perils of Travel. It's available from Douglas and McIntyre. My thanks to author Steve Burgess.
A pleasure.